You are all in for such a treat tonight as we are joined by these two fantastic authors. Caroline is a professor of French and comparative literature at Barnard College and Columbia University. Her latest book, Proust's Duchess, won the French Heritage Society Book Prize and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography and the American Library in Paris Book Award. She publishes widely in the non-academic press and many outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and W Magazine. Catie Marron is a dedicated reader with a lifelong passion for literature. Her career has encompassed investment banking, magazine journalism, public service, and book publishing. She's a contributing editor at Vogue magazine, an expert on public squares and urban green spaces, and an accomplished fundraiser at the New York Public Library and the High Line. You guys, if you've not gotten your hands on this book yet, Becoming a Gardener, you have so much to look forward to. It is simply exquisite, all-encompassing. It incorporates practical, artistic, visual, philosophical views, all of what gardening can do for us personally. So without further ado, I am going to pass things over to our guests of honor, who we are so grateful to have with us today. Take it away, Catie and Caroline.
All right, well, thank you for having us, and thank you, Catie, for inviting me to be the one to talk to you about your magnificent book. I will say, by way of full disclosure from the outset, that Catie is a very dear friend of mine, one of my favorite people. And I've loved your past two books, but this is my favorite of all. And it's not always the case that one loves one's friend's books as much as one loves one's friend, but in this case, it really has turned out to be so. So I can't emphasize enough what a joy this book was to read. And I hope some of that will come through tonight when Catie tells us more about it. Catie, I thought I might start with a very broad question, which has to do with the subtitle of the book. I loved seeing you pairing reading and digging as the kind of the two components of becoming a gardener. Can you talk to me about how those two activities or aspects animated and yielded this particular book project? Because I think it's a big part of what makes it unique and special.
Gladly, and also again, thank you to Art, Julia, and Bookhampton. We're really excited about this. To Caroline's question, I am a book lover, as Dana just said, and was very involved for a long time in the New York Public Library. So I'm sure a lot of you are book lovers and would appreciate the reading side of this, which is that a decade or so ago, I heard a quote by Cicero, which he said over 2,000 years ago, which is, if you have a garden and a library, you have all you need. And I was perplexed by that comment and very curious about it. I knew I loved gardens, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and I really wanted to understand what he meant. On the other side, the digging side, much more practical. Several years ago, our family bought a new house in Connecticut, and it's a beautiful house made for a family who lived in it for 20 years before they sold it to us. We definitely made it our own. We made various changes, as most people do, of course, when they buy a new house, and it felt like us. But for some reason, I don't know why, I always felt like I was living in someone else's house. And I did various things. With the architect, I waved sage around doors and windows, which is something I'd never done before. And somehow it just wasn't clicking in. One day I was walking our dog, and I suddenly thought, well, if I root myself to the land, which is what we love most about the house, then perhaps that would root me to the house. And so suddenly, after having wanted to make a garden for so many years, I had the time, I had the place, and the purpose. So that's what I did.
And you say early on in the book that the project of making a new garden became something else entirely over the course of the work that you did. Could you talk a little bit about how you started out, what your inspirations were? I mean, for book lovers, I will say one of the many treasures and joys of this book is that you are so you acknowledge your debt to and your sort of imaginative rootedness in a lot of the books that you've read that have beautiful gardens, beautiful images. What were your starting points, and then how did the enterprise change over time?
I'm really glad Caroline brought that up, because the book is, again, in a way, two parts. It's about making the garden and what I learned as I did that. And the book mainly is about what is the meaning of gardens more than how do you make a garden. But a big part of the book is weaving through the advice, the wisdom, the humor of a lot of garden writers, the best of the garden writers. And I have found generally, not surprisingly, the majority are from England, and they're all quirky individuals, very quirky, and they have very strong points of view. What I did was to go to my little library of gardening books. For some reason, even though I never had a garden, I collected gardening books, and I had several shelves. I started reading them. I wrote down all sorts of notes, and then I weaved the best of what I thought they'd said into the narrative of the story. So you'll hear a lot of voices in the story.
And they're great voices, and some of them are really unexpected too. I became an accidental gardener during the pandemic because it was the first time I ever had enough time at my little place in Connecticut to put down any roots in that way. But I didn't have the gardening library or the sort of vision that you had about how to make the books in your world actually inform your garden. And so it was really such a pleasant surprise for me to find out that all these writers I admired for other reasons had written about gardens. So Eudora Welty, Jamaica Kincaid. I mean, the voices in the book are, I would say some of the really funniest ones are the eccentric English garden specialists, but there's such a kind of a symphony of voices. And I think that's part of what makes the book feel so welcoming too. You feel like you're being welcomed into a world of gardeners. And you have somewhere, there's a great quote that you cite. There are also beautiful quotations from different writers throughout literary history, including one by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is it's tell me the garden you imagine and I'll tell you who you are.
Yeah, tell me the garden you're dreaming of and I'll tell you who you are. And what Caroline points out, and I'll just emphasize, is that most of the writers, curiously, are not writers about gardens. They're writers about all sorts of things. They're journalists, they're novelists, they, all a huge range of things. But they happen to have a garden, and they are so in love with their garden that they feel compelled to write about it.
Yeah, and I think the thing that struck me, and I hadn't seen your book before it came out, but the Rousseau quote is actually a play on on kind of a common French idiom, which is tell me who you're friends with, and I'll tell you who you are. And so I love the idea that basically the garden becomes a friend. You talk about, talking to your plants. You talk about the sort of the community of fellow gardeners that you enter into. So there is this wonderful, even when it's a solitary activity, when you're digging alone, one feels in reading your discovery of this wonderful activity, one feels you supported by this community that you describe as being these many voices. And some of them are witty and some of them are helpful. And you'll take notes when you buy this book, which I hope all of you will. There'll be little tidbits that are useful in different ways, but sometimes they're just, an amazing kind of philosophical thought or an insight that you carry away the way you would from a conversation with a good friend. Who were some of your best friends in that world while you were gardening? Like, did you have some favorites? There are a number of people who you quote more than once, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm just seeing a quote right there by Beverly Nichols, who was a very humorous, charming journalist in the mid-20th century in England. He's a favorite. Jamaica Kincaid, very opinionated. She's a favorite. Eleanor Perenya is a name you might not know, but she was a great writer, and she's put down her roots in Connecticut. She's a favorite. There are many. I could keep thinking about favorites. One thing that I have found curious, and particularly for all those Art Julia followers tonight, is that obviously, as I said, all of the majority of writers would be English, but of the Americans, the vast majority.
So sorry, please forgive me, the terrible game going.
The vast majority live in the East Coast, and the vast majority of those live in Connecticut. Michael Pollan wrote a book before he moved to California called Second Nature about building his garden in Connecticut. And it was curious how often the writers were from Connecticut.
Well, and speaking of Connecticut, and I just did what I always yell at my students for not doing, which is I left my phone on before Katie and I started. I'm very sorry for the interruption. Talk to us a little bit about Connecticut, actually. And one of the things I love, I mean, one of the things I've always admired and appreciated about you in our friendship is just you have an incredible eye and a sensibility that's very well thought out and personal, and it always has a logic to it that seems very simple and self-evident once it's been carried out. But when you start from any range of possibilities for how to proceed on a particular project, be it a garden or the decorating of a room, or the choice of flowers or light fixtures, there's a real thoughtfulness to it. And I think a lot of the thoughtfulness around what you chose to do with your garden had to do with the specificity of Connecticut versus the other place where you'd had a lot of trees that you love, the other place where you had outdoor space, which was on Long Island. Can you talk a little bit about Connecticut specifically and why and how that inspired you?
Yeah, gladly. Connecticut is obviously in New England. And I don't know why, who knows why we all feel whatever we do, but from the time I was a young child, whenever I drove into Connecticut and saw those blue and white license plates, I felt comfortable. I felt at home. So it was very exciting to have a house in Connecticut versus somewhere else. It did give me that sense of roots, which I don't think about all day long, I assure you. But and it gave me a sense of colonial America. I think New England has that. And in colonial American, early American gardens, most of them were about vegetables because first and foremost, people needed to eat. And they were generally very attractive. And I mean, I studied them, but I really wanted the garden to fit into its place. And to me, that place in Connecticut being the colonial garden area, an area of once upon a time colonial gardens, I decided to make it a kitchen garden, which is largely a vegetable garden versus, let's say, a perennial bed, which is beautiful and all about the flowers. I think it suits my personality too. What Caroline was talking about, tell me what you dream of. And I do have this, I guess you describe it, sense of purpose. And there's that purpose of raising vegetables, which really appealed to me.
And it's so beautiful in its execution. And the book, it has these spectacular watercolors and beautiful photographs. So aesthetically, it's incredibly pleasing, your colonial garden. Talk to us a little bit about how you set about doing it. How did you make it happen? I mean, there's a really interesting section on fencing and how you chose to fence things in. And how did you choose what you put in the garden? How did you choose how you structured it, where you placed it, all of that?
Yeah, I'd like to mention, not only did I have what I came to think of as my literary mentors, but I had two real life mentors. And I'll tell you just a little aside. I was at Graveside Manor and wanted to go see their huge kitchen garden. It was the size of 2.5 football fields. It was vast. And luckily, for some reason, I bumped into the head gardener and I asked him what would his secret be to gardening and to learning how to garden. And he said, watch what a gardener, a more knowledgeable gardener does and do it. And I thought that was superb advice. And I think it's so true. I have had in this garden 2 real life mentors who have helped me. They've guided me. They have taught me a tremendous amount. One is Catherine Schiavone, who was a landscape designer with Miranda Brooks when she helped us with a different, smaller garden in Long Island. And the other one is a woman named Gay Parise, who loves her vegetables and has great technical knowledge about plants. So you can hear they have very complementary skills, and they were very generous in letting the decisions be mine, which was important for the book and for what I was trying to do. So together we all made the garden, and it was Catherine I looked to a lot for advice on what sort of plants to plant. And Gay would tell us, oh, the light is good here, or, you know, you're in too much shade there. and why one plant might work more than another. But again, one thing I learned very quickly, and I think every gardener knows, no matter what their level, is that gardening is all about trial and error. You'll have lots of errors and lots of failure, and that's just part of the game. And I actually think in its own way a rewarding part of the game. Yeah. And you learn all the way along, which is, I think, an exciting thing to do.
So what kinds of things did you learn? I mean, your title is so evocative that somehow by digging and by reading, and by gardening effectively, you could learn more about living. So embracing failure is one lesson learned. What were some of the other takeaways that you gathered from this experience of putting together a garden?
Certainly they're the practical ones. And there is a quote by Beverly Nichols that I love, which is that he said, actually, for some reason, this is the quote I have right here when I mentioned Beverly Nichols.
We have a pile.
This is purely coincidental. But he writes, light in the garden is a quarter of the battle. Another quarter is the soil of the garden. A third quarter is the skill and care of the gardener. The fourth quarter is luck. Indeed, one might say that these were the 4 L's of gardening in the following order of importance: loam, light, love, and luck. And a huge fact that I learned is the importance of soil. Mm-hmm. I never expected to appreciate soil as much as I did, and I never expected to read scientific books on the subject of soil, which I did. It's a complicated subject, but it is the foundation for plants. And it is very simply, if you have good soil, you will have good plants. If you don't have good soil, no matter what you do, you won't have good plants. So from a practical standpoint, that's a big one. In all of my reading, and particularly as I started out on the more emotional side, I read that gardens provide joy, happiness, just pure pleasure in looking at the beauty. They provide a sense of escape, a sanctuary. They teach patience, they teach perseverance. They hone your senses to be more aware of the life around you. Mm-hmm. And over time, here and there, I would experience pretty much all of those feelings. And that was exciting to hear.
Yeah, no, and it is, I think, one of the really inspiring things that comes through in your book and comes through in the many gardeners and gardening aficionados with whom you're in dialogue throughout the book, is this idea that whenever you start gardening, whatever age you are, wherever you are, however much or little space you've got, that there's always somewhere really wonderful you can go. One of the quotes I really love from your book, and I've said this to you before, but is from Thomas Jefferson, who had obviously these spectacular and important gardens at Monticello in my hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia. And he wrote somewhere, though but an old man, I am a young gardener. That, you know, at any stage, I mean, I feel like I was 50 when I started gardening during the pandemic, and I learned so much about, as you say, about patience, about dealing with failure, about being in a flow state and the pleasures of that. And it was nice to feel like at 50, I could learn something brand new. And so I love that you've written this book, which I think, again, Dana was saying to us before we got on the call that this is a book for everyone. And I think part of why that's true is that gardening opens you up into this world of possibilities, you know, emotional, aesthetic, scientific, all these different directions that it will take you if you're receptive, and there's no limit to it. So that to me is one of the inspiring things about the book, is you actually demonstrate over the course of the book how you develop a garden, but also all of these threads that feed into it along the way. Were there any threads that particularly surprised you? Was there anything but beyond becoming a soil expert, which as your friend, I was surprised by that too, but it's really helpful to know now. What else surprised you about what you learned?
That's interesting. I was surprised by how quickly certain plants come up. Mm-hmm. And of course, at the same time, how some never come up. But one time I remember very clearly was a Friday in early September in 2019. And we had just created the beds, we had designed the layout, that seemed to work well. And so we put in some late summer vegetables. That Friday happened to be a Friday the 13th. And it also happened to be the day of a full moon, the harvest moon. And those two together were not going to happen for another 30 years. So it was in its own way a dicey day.
Yeah.
And when I learned that midday, I sort of got a little bit nervous about everyone. Our daughter is a horseback rider, a jumper, and she'd fallen. She was fine, but little things like that happened. So I was very happy when everyone was home and peacefully safe and sound. And I went out to the garden to look at it. And I was stunned, I mean, seriously stunned to see so many vegetables, particularly lettuce, up and thriving and ready to harvest. And they say that you should harvest on full moon if you possibly can. That's according to moon gardening, which is something that was created many, many, many eons ago in different cultures and has been used to this day. Anyway,
The surprise of the.
So it was exciting to be able to pull up lettuces. I'd never pulled up a lettuce in my life. So imagine that, and pull up radishes and pull up turnips. And obviously we had a great salad, but we also had a delicious turnip puree. And this is due to Gay, who I mentioned earlier, who insisted that I plant white turnips, and which did not particularly appeal to me. But she said, oh, they're delicious. And that turnip puree was, in fact, delicious. There are many writers who will tell you that anything that comes from your own garden will taste better than if it comes from elsewhere, which makes sense, I think, to all of us. And I would say it's true. But that day was a wonderful surprise. And it was a day filled with joy.
Yeah. No, and you described, there's such a kind of beautiful family memory of having a family dinner with all of this stuff from your own backyard. And I think also living in New York City most of the time, as you do, as I do, it's easy to start to feel disconnected from the earth and from the products of the earth. So to be in your own house in Connecticut, pulling in fresh turnips and fresh lettuce, it's a special thing. And it's also really interesting. I mean, you had started this project. I know you said you've been thinking about doing something about gardening for a long time, but the timing of it was interesting in the sense that you began just less than a year before the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden all of us were at home. And I think in the early days, at least in New York, when people were washing their groceries, the idea of being able to eat stuff from your own garden would have sounded particularly appealing. So how did the pandemic play into your garden project, and what was that like to have that outlet during such a strange time?
Well, the minute the pandemic hit, we bolted to Connecticut. And at that point, the house was still very new to us. We had not slept there very many nights. So we were sort of breaking it in at that time. I always felt so fortunate to have a place to walk outside. And I really felt for people who are in apartments where they can't go outside and how difficult that would be. But it taught me, again, several things. One is that I think I was a bit naive to think that I could commute from New York City and create this magnificent garden. It really helped when I was getting it established to be there all the time. And it helped, and it was a great pleasure to observe nature. A lot of people have talked about this, if they have had that kind of opportunity, about being around nature day in, day out, and watching the changes. One writer, Rosemary Veary, talked about the fact that she could actually tell you the date of the year, depending on what was happening in her garden. During COVID and that time in the spring, you probably all remember that it was a gray, cold spring, a nasty spring. And we got one sunny day, but then we felt like we were back to 5 or 6 gray ones. What we had done early in the fall was plant tulips, thinking that they would come, bloom, and would take out the bulbs before we planted vegetables, which timing worked great. Catherine had a great idea of planting roses early, mid, and late, so we would have a continual sense of bloom. And that was great. We We ordered different types that I liked. We threw them all into bags. We did not know what was what, other than we knew that they were early, mid, or late. So we'd have one row of each. And those tulips came up in the most joyous colors, the most vibrant, lively colors. And for all of us, the idea when you walked out on a gray day to see those glorious colors was something I'm sure we are all going to remember. It was very meaningful to all of us.
Yeah. How about you talked at one point about having each of the members of your immediate family choose a particular type of tree to plant. Can you talk about that? Because that's such a beautiful. I wish that I have a husband and 4 dogs. I don't have any children to choose a tree, but that to me was such a beautiful way of kind of building your family into the landscape. You described at one point your husband of so many years, Don Marron, as having been the root system of your life. So I love that you did this kind of, you had a root system that was dictated by the members of your family. What did your kids choose? What did Don choose? And what did those choices mean?
I remember one quote off the bat by, again, an English woman who moved to Connecticut and saying that if you plant a tree, you've changed the landscape forever, which, just tells you about the significance of planting a tree. Years ago, I read that one writer always wanted trees for her birthday instead of birthday gifts. I read that one young man wanted trees for his bar mitzvah instead of other sorts of presents. And I read that one young couple asked for trees for their wedding. So those ideas had always stuck in my mind. And I thought, well, again, to root us to this house, why don't we all plant our own tree? And we'd have a sense of ownership of that tree and watch it grow. I must say, my husband and son were not all that interested in what tree they planted. So they did get a lot of guidance from me. My husband, in the end, chose an American beech, which is a Native American tree. It's a tree that a lot of you know keeps its leaves year round. It's a stately tree, and yet it's a common tree. They're everywhere. And in a way, that rather mirrored my husband, because he came from a very, very simple upbringing, and yet at the same time, he had a lot of accomplishment in his life. So it was, again, both. And it's also a wonderful shade tree. And I think of Don protecting all of us with his shade. My son chose a certain kind of oak, and that's a strong tree of long life, and it also grows tall. And I think William has that kind of foundation and solidity to him, and he's also tall. So that suited him. My daughter and I chose trees more for their beauty. My daughter loves lavender and purple and lilac, and so she chose a great lilac, and it blooms all the time, and I just thought that was very, very suitable for her. And I chose a crabapple tree because when I truly think, and I've thought about this many times, that my very first memory in life is from being in my crib and looking outside and seeing the moon coming through a crabapple tree outside of my window. So that tree has always mattered a lot to me, and that's what I chose.
How are they all doing? Are all the trees doing okay?
The trees are all doing okay. Yeah, they're doing okay. Unfortunately, as all of you in Connecticut particularly know, there's been a terrible disease of ash trees, and a lot have had to come down. And it's sort of scary now that people are start talking about beech trees having an illness. So I worry a bit about that. But no, right now the trees are all thriving.
And I love, it's amazing to me, but not surprising, knowing you and seeing the book that you were able to create, to hear that, that would be your first memory, is the moon coming through the crabapple tree branches. And I think one of the things that I love about your book is that you start out very early in the book with talking about essentially garden images and books about outdoor spaces and gardens that influenced you and that stayed with you as a child. And some of those are books that I loved so much as well. And so you almost start out like in the childhood of your own existence as a gardener, but you trace its roots back to childhood. Can you talk a little bit about some of those images and some of those books that had gardens that stayed in your mind?
Gladly. Starting off, I guess, I tell you about the gardening gene, which I read about quite a few times. And there's a theory that the gardening gene jumps a generation. So that would be the grandparents passing it on to grandchildren, and from there on. There have been a lot of, stories about that happening. In our family, we did not have a garden. So I really came to gardens first through books. And one other thing I've learned about gardening is the need for imagination, because everyone's going to have a blank slate when they start to garden, and they have to imagine things. So, you go back you start thinking back to your childhood. There is one writer, Robin Lane Fox, who has been writing a column in the FT, Weekend FT, some of you I'm sure know, for over 50 years. And he said, the memories of flowers stay with us to the end. And I think that's true. I write about Secret Garden, which is a book so many of us have read. And I also think, of course, about Peter Rabbit and how he quickly escapes, out of the garden and the cabbages. And every so often our cabbages would have a lot of holes in them. And I think about Peter Rabbit potentially having been there. I touch on Madeline, which was a series of books I particularly love, and simply because the first book talks about the Luxembourg Gardens. And Carolina and I actually have a happy memory of being in the Luxembourg Gardens together one winter day. But I first visited it at age 23, my first visit to Paris. And I was so moved by this garden on a really cold, sunny, crisp winter day that I started to cry. And, I'm talking to you about roots and sage and crying.
That's not, you're not that.
That's not my normal way.
Yeah.
And, but it clearly moved me so much. I went there every single time. I've been to Paris ever since. So that was an inspiration. I thought about other gardens of my childhood that I visited and how they stuck with me. So they say about gardening that one writer says you get many doses of pleasure because you have the present to appreciate, you have the future to look forward to think about what will this plant be like in 3 years, 3 months, or 3 years, and then you have the past, because you do go into your memory bank to remember gardens, to try to figure out what you want to do with the garden right now. And it's this wonderful amorphous way with time.
Yeah.
That is another thing I've come to very much appreciate.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite takeaways from your book, is that you speak very movingly and very eloquently about those 3 temporal modalities. So present, what I'm doing now, and you might want to talk about this, if you'd like to talk about this a little more, the sort of flow state when you're in, and when you're working in the garden, and time. I think I told you in an email over the weekend, I went up to Connecticut where I hadn't been in a month or two, and it was terribly overgrown. Nobody had been to mow. And I spent such a blissful Sunday. I think I was in the garden for 12 hours, and it could have been 1 minute, it could have been 5 days, just pulling. So that kind of intense awareness of the present is so special. But then, as you say, you get these 2 modalities of memories of the past and imagination of the future. And to have all 3 of those modalities activated in one activity, I think is quite rare. I can't think of another one where that's the case. But I really love the way you talked about the flow state. Can you talk about that a little bit, in case our listeners aren't familiar with that concept and how that worked for you in the garden?
Sure. That concept comes from Charlotte Mendelson, a writer in England, who's just written another novel, but she's a New Yorker writer a lot. And she referred to it. And it's the idea that you are getting so immersed into an activity that you really like that you lose all sense of time. And you're just so zoned in on what you're doing. And I think to have that opportunity in our lives, which not only have so much complication and so much sadness for so many, but they're also very frenetic.
Yeah.
They're continually frenetic for everybody. And I think having that ability to sort of step back, even if it's for 15 minutes, is a big pleasure in life.
Yeah, no, and it sounds like it, it stood you in very good stead during a difficult period. What are you most excited to get back to in your garden now? Like, do you have any plans for the future? Any things that you mentioned a few places in the book? Oh, maybe I'll try that next time. Or what plans do you have for your garden? What are things you'd like to try that you haven't tried yet?
We've scaled it back a little because one important practical fact I learned is I strongly recommend that if you start a garden, start small. Start smaller in a way than you expect, because it will take more of your time, more of your effort, more of your thinking than you realize. You'll also, if you do happen to make vegetables, produce vegetables, you'll have many more vegetables than you ever expected to have, which is a good thing.
Oh, just what do you want to plan? What are you planning to do? So yeah, you did say that you delimited your space very well in the beginning, but you were saying that you want to kind of delimit it even more going forward for this reason, or?
Well, so I did, and I also actually put in something called a cover crop, which is really just something that's very healthy for soil, to really restore the soil this year. But it was honestly also to save me from thinking about what I was doing with those beds, because it was more than I could manage. And I had, advice and help, and I worked a huge amount at it. But if I'm not able to do it every day, it was a lot. So that is one thing I've done this year. What I'm particularly looking forward to, for some reason, is my grapes and my currants.
Oh, okay.
And we planted them around the walls, the fences of the garden, and I just love them. And so I'm very much looking forward to seeing those grapes grow and be more edible, and currants to be there, the raspberries to be there. And so funnily enough, this year, I'm more interested in the fruit than ever.
Interesting. Okay. But I think that's the other thing the garden gives you, right? Is that the sky's the limit in terms of what you can try, at least. So you did a bunch of tulips, you can do a bunch of fruit. Anything is possible. But I really appreciated your advice about starting small too, because just practically speaking, as you say, like just the volume of weeds that I extracted from my very small garden this Sunday was insane. And yet when that garden is doing well, it feels like there's an infinite world in even kind of a small space. So it's really, really thrilling. One of the things I also loved about your book, and this is why part of what makes your book so special, and Dana mentioned this at the beginning, is that you touch on so many different facets of gardening. So writers about gardens, great writers who weren't gardeners, but who are writing about gardens, your own personal experiences, practical tips, takeaways like the 4 L's. But you also intensely engage with the idea and the look and the feel of other gardens that have been meaningful to you to visit. And you even come up with a little list of recommended destination vacations if you ever want to just go and spend a weekend visiting a particular garden and getting inspired. You have a few of those ideas. Can you talk about some of those places? Because a lot of those were really wonderful, and I have a lot now on my list to go see.
Certainly. One is in the winter. I did this by season, and I think of the winter and Pete Udoff, who some people would consider the foremost landscape designer today. He is known in New York for the High Line, and I've always my favorite time in the High Line has always been the end of winter, when there's that slanting winter light and you see the berries and the grasses. And I think that's so beautiful that I would love to go see his garden or gardens in the Netherlands. That I talk about Derek Jarman, who has a very strong cult following. I'm sure some of you know who he was, and very sensitive man, a filmmaker. And he had a very unusual garden in a very rough area on the English Channel. And he had a small fisherman's cottage, and he collected flints and would create these designs with the stones and plant the flowers. And no one needs a ticket to go. You can just wander in, wherever you are. It was near a nuclear plant, so you'd have that looming in the distance, and it sounds rather otherworldly, and I would be very curious to see it. A garden that has been an inspiration for me, particularly since I wanted to do a kitchen garden, is Monticello. And that Jefferson's garden is 1,000 feet long, and it would be row after row after row of beautiful plants and vegetables. He loved vegetables. He grew, I think, 90 some odd varieties of peas, over 100 varieties of kidney beans. He really was more passionate, I think, about his garden. He would tell you this anyway, than he was about running the country.
Or writing the Declaration of Independence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Founding a university.
I think what he says, the person who does the most for one's country is the person who brings a new plant into its country. Of course, when you think about Jefferson, you think about all of his accomplishments, you also realize that a lot of what he did, and certainly what he did in the garden, could only have been done with the help of many hands. And of course, many of those hands would be people he enslaved. And I investigated that a bit. I found a wonderful painting, actually, ironically painted only about 30 years ago, yet it, to me, looked like it had been painted many years ago, of two slaves working in the fields, and you could feel the guts of their work. You could feel the heat. You could feel the thriving vegetables right beneath them. Curiously, many of the slaves would have their own garden on their own land, and they would tend to their garden at the end of the day after they were done with work at Monticello. And they were, I'll say aloud, I suppose, to sell their produce. And I think in doing so, they carved out, a slight bit of independence for themselves. So, it's two-edged, but it is an amazing garden that I have never seen, and I really would like to visit.
Oh no, we'll go together because yeah, no, and I learned something too from that part of your book, and I think you wrote so sensitively and beautifully, thoughtfully about Monticello, because it is such an ambivalent legacy. On the one hand, Jefferson and his amazing inventiveness and enterprise, and also just the beauty of that garden, and on the other hand, the fact that slave labor is what made it all possible is incredibly difficult to wrap one's mind around, and you write about both of those sides so well. But one of the things I learned is you talk about how actually some of the produce that the slaves grew was actually produce that they had brought from Africa, that they were able to then, in terms of memory and imagination, they were able to take that bit of home and cultivate it in the New World. And I thought that was really, really amazing. But I love that he was your inspiration for a kitchen garden. What about other gardens of your dreams? There, you talk about Nympha, for instance, that's on my list where I've never been.
Yeah, I mentioned Luxembourg Gardens, which is certainly one of my two favorite places, and was my favorite place in the world until I discovered Nympha. And our family discovered it, a dozen or so years ago now. It is extraordinary. I so strongly recommend. Hi, Dana. I think it's probably good to wrap up. Anyway, it is the most beautiful garden that started in medieval times. It then lay in ruins until the early 20th century. It's a wild garden. It's a very romantic garden. It's the only time I've used the word paradise. And in fact, I was watching a video of interview with Arabella Levitt's Boyd, a very legendary English landscape designer. She used the same word, paradise. And it's a magical, magical place. I strongly recommend trying to see it someday if you can.
All right, well, we do have Dana coming on. Dana, are you turning us over to Q&A now?
I am. We've got a comment here from Anne. When she first saw the book, it was plastic wrapped. It moved her so much that she purchased it. Loved the words and illustrations. Captured the magic place you go when you work in the garden. Which brings me to a question about the writing process for this book. As you were saying, there's so much incorporated into what we have here. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, gladly. The other two books that you had mentioned earlier, and Caroline mentioned, were books on city parks and city squares. They were very different from each other, but they were both the same in the sense that the compilations of essays came up with the idea, it came up with the various places. I found the writers who wrote essays for the book. And therefore, I didn't write the book. And I wrote the introduction, but that was it. And in this case, I tackled writing the book. Caroline, I see it in every email she writes, is a natural writer. She writes so fluidly, so beautifully on anything, with humor, with seriousness. And no writer does it with ease, but it looks easy. And this was anything but easy for me. And so it took a lot. It took a lot to get it organized and get the lay of the land. And then, you know, it was iteration after iteration after iteration after iteration. When I was doing City Square, one woman sent me, okay, draft number 18. And I would swear that I had many more drafts than 8.
Yeah. But you are, we were talking with your book about your book with Tony Marks, the president of the New York Public Library, not that long ago. And he said that what drew him in from the beginning was the beauty of the writing. And I have to say, and I said to you privately, that was what it took me by surprise to just see the real deep beauty of your writing and the care that you took, the way you would care for a garden, you cared for the language of your book. And so it's really, the book is a pleasure to read. And it, even if it takes many, I have a fellow writer friend of mine always has this mantra, every word hurts. So even if every word hurt, the result is something really special and very readable. And it's great that somebody could intuit that even just in the plastic shrink wrapped book, but that you'd open it up and discover the beauty of the language, which is a rarity and is something really special.
Oh, yeah, and thank you for that comment. That was very nice.
You mentioned about the full moon earlier, and tonight is actually a full moon. Does that have some meanings that you can share with the group on their garden, on harvesting, on why maybe it's a good time to harvest?
Sure. There is a concept which I briefly touched on called moon gardening. And it will basically tell you that you plant, harvest everything according to the moon cycle. When the moon is growing, waxing, it's bringing the gravitational pull is bringing moisture up to the top of the soil. And that's the time when you should be planting crops that grow above ground. When the full moon is out, they will tell you that's the time to harvest because all plants will be at their fullest. Then the moon starts dipping and waning. And as it does that, the gravitational pull weakens and the water comes down. And that's the time to plant root crops and crops where the growth is happening around. I found it very interesting. I read one book by a man who swears that he never has had to do any irrigation, any watering in his garden because it follows the pattern of the moon. So there are definitely a lot of people out there, particularly, for instance, farmers in France, you know, very agricultural based country, which who follow the patterns of the moon.
And there are some, for lovers of watercolor, these beautiful watercolors I mentioned in your book, there's one, it's a 2-page spread, right, of the moon in its different states. That's so special. Anyway, I had another question, but I want to hear other people's questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, we're going to ask a little bit about soil. I know you had touched on that earlier too, and that was one of the things that you found surprising, that if it's bad soil, you're not going to get good crops or good plants. Is there a tip that people should look out for as far as what's good and what's bad?
Yeah, definitely. I think you should test your soil, and you can test it and send it to a university lab. There are a lot of them. And for a very small fee, in the teens, let's say, of dollars, they will test your soil for you and send you back reams of statistics about what is good or not good about your soil. And then of course you get somebody to interpret it. The pH balance is sort of the most important fact that you can obviously see on your own, but it will tell you a lot about what you need to do to make the soil healthy for plants.
Interesting. Catie, did you have another question?
Oh,
Oh, sorry, Caroline.
yeah, Katie may have questions.
Yeah.
I don't remember what it was. Yeah, I was unexpectedly blown away by your soil section, and you talk about chocolate earth, right? Can you talk about that sort of devil's food cake quality when soil is good?
Yeah, when we were creating our site, we took out a beat up old small basketball court and a really beat up cutting garden where there was not a flower to be had and the fence had fallen down and all, and saw the soil and it was full of rocks and it was very sandy. It was terrible. And so I found somebody who was fantastic at really digging down and layering the soil in different ways to produce healthy soil. And he produced beautiful soil. It's what one writer called devil's food cake. And one day I was there and sitting on the ground looking forward to digging, and I thought, oh my gosh, this looks exactly like devil's food cake. So I thought it was a wonderful description.
Wow. Well, believe it or not, we're already at that time, but for our readers, when they pick up your book, after they're finished reading it, what is your hope that they take away, their biggest takeaway from this book?
I'd say two things. One is just in general, and I hadn't thought about this initially about myself, but in trying to do something new. And somebody said, oh, you know, it's great that you're doing something different and forging something new. And I think it just tells anyone that try something new. It's fun. And, you know, it's just for yourself. You're not going to, any mistakes you make, big deal. But what has also been incredibly moving to me is how many people are now telling me that they're inspired to make a garden. And they're really serious about it and what they're doing. And that I've loved. So if one or the other happens, I would say that my book has been successful.
And to start small.
And to start. Very.
Well, thank you both, Caroline and Catie, for being with us this evening. What a fabulous discussion. And congratulations to you again, Catie, on this spectacular, gorgeous book. Everyone, Becoming a Gardener, What Reading and Digging Taught Me About Living by Catie Marron is out now. It's available for purchase at RJ Julia, Wesleyan RJ Julia, and Bookhampton. So go grab your copies. And thank you for supporting your independent local bookstores. It truly means the world to us. We could not do what we do without you all. So happy reading, everyone, and have a fantastic night.